Okay. So, Dylan, if you would go ahead and introduce our guest speaker here for our Twitch audience, and then we'll.
Okay. So, as I mentioned earlier, Cara got her start, at least in the games world, doing testing for Grand Theft Auto 4. She then went on to make a name for herself, doing games writing for a number of sites, including some really excellent stuff for Rock, Paper, Shotgun. She, of course, wrote the book that we're talking about. She has since done work with the BBC on a really cool sort of interactive science fiction show, and is currently a narrative designer at Media Molecule, who made the Little Big Planet games and is currently working on Dreams. Is that the name? Okay, and it seems like we're not getting audio again.
I did not hear that.
Give me 1 second. Cara, it looks like we've lost audio for you for a second. We're seeing out what that's from.
Can you talk for us, Cara?
Yeah. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Okay, cool. Yes, James is the next thing that Media Molecule is working on.
So you're going in and out here. Are you? Yeah. Are you on a hard line or wireless?
I'm on Wi-Fi.
Wi-Fi. Okay. So I think that's might be where the sound issue is coming from right now, because you're coming in and out. Is the sound that we're hearing?
Oh. Okay. Well, I could try calling in from my phone, my iPhone. It might work. I don't know.
I think we're okay for right now.
Yeah, right now you're actually sounding great.
It's just every time we try to talk about games.
Yeah.
Oh no! Those dang video games again.
Yeah. So yeah, we actually have a bunch of questions for you, but I guess just to start at the beginning, we want to know what sort of drove you to do this initial plan, to kind of, where you come up with the idea of traveling the world and doing this, and were you surprised by the initial response to that?
Yeah, I mean, the thing that made me really start to do it is that I was really broke, and I didn't have any money, and surprisingly, I think a weird thing about the internet is that everyone thinks that games journalists are rich because of all the bribes that we get for, like, giving, Ubisoft games 60% on PC Gamer. Because games journalists have so many yachts, you have no idea. Like, we just are secretly rich and we run the world. No, I was really broke. Generally speaking, the fee for a feature around about the time I was writing, you would spend about 3 days on writing a feature about a game, and they would give you about $150. So it wasn't amazing. And at the time I had quite an expensive rent, so I was writing and pitching like crazy and still not really making it. So I thought to myself, what is the largest amount of money a month I could possibly receive for writing this stuff that I write? And it seemed like $1,000 was about the maximum I could ever see earning. And then I also thought, if I asked if I asked the internet, if I could do my dream project and see if they would give me money for a flight or something, then I would write this essay for them about this cultural thing. And I'd floated it on Twitter before, but I don't know. I for whatever reason, I just thought I'll maybe try out this idea. But the thing, the catalyst for it really was that I was broke, and I was a little bit drunk also when I posted it on Patreon. And I actually accidentally evicted myself from my own flat because in an hour I had the money. And so I had to make good on my word. So I actually had to phone my flatmate and be like, I think I'm moving out. And she was like, what? Why? Oh my God. And I was like, well, I think I did this thing on the internet and I don't really understand what I've done. And now I have to leave. I'm really sorry. So,
Another story of the internet making people homeless.
I know, the internet made me homeless. That probably wouldn't have been as good a title for the book, but
and I guess just as sort of a quick question, but do you think a platform like Patreon, could something like this have happened without those sort of project crowdfunding sites?
Definitely not. I feel like Patreon definitely opened up this avenue for me, but I have to say that the Patreon was actually fundamentally embraced by a lot of queer and marginalized creators who came before me, and they ultimately encouraged me to use it as a platform. But I think Patreon actually, in the beginning at least, was a place where it was like a last resort for people. Now it's a place where you go and, you know, if you're from like you're like the guys from IGN, the ex-IGN guys who they've started their streaming service and things and the subscription stuff, like they get like so much more money than I could ever imagine for what their work, because they came from that like very popular platform and then straight into Patreon. But when I started using Patreon, it was like people were getting, you know, like something like $50 a month for, you know, the thing that they wanted to do. And so that platform was really tested out and, you know, like quality assured by people who didn't have so many opportunities, and they really supported me and encouraged me. And I guess the book wouldn't exist without them. So, you know, really good work from them. And I think that, you know, I think if you go on Patreon these days, I think you should be seeking out those people who are like a little bit like more left field than you might imagine, and a little bit like more unusual, and not receiving very much for what they do. They're really valuable and worth looking at.
Thank you. That's some really great insight. One thing that as you went, well, actually, Chris, this is more your question, so I'll let you do this.
Yeah, and Dylan and I have really different methods of asking questions, whereas Dylan actually has questions, but I just say, please talk about this thing. So please talk about this thing. You, in the book, it seems like you spend a lot of time with folks involved in the art side of game development. What's your perspective on those involved in more of the business side of it, and how does that play in? Because like a lot of the people you talk to seem to have to wear all the hats, but it seemed like you focused on more of the art and creation elements of it than the marketing and selling part of it. And how do those two play in together?
I mean, obviously one directly influences the other, like the amount of money and resource you have to make your game directly influences it. But I didn't really delve much into the business of making games, mainly because I don't, and I still kind of don't really know very much about it. I guess technically speaking, you could say that in the gig economy, everyone is their own business. And I guess for a long time on Twitter, I certainly was like, you know, the only PR friend I had. So I just like cracked jokes every day on Twitter to keep people amused and interested in what I was doing. And then they would read my articles whenever I'd written one. But I don't really have a fantastically big insight into how to, for example, fund your game or how to get investment, because actually it's kind of fundamentally one of the hardest things you can try to do in games is to get investment for something, because games are fantastically risky to make. A lot of people I covered in the book, they got their money from either having a day job or from personal savings, or they developed their games on the side whilst they, like, you know, Nina made these little games whilst she was studying at NYU, for example. So a lot of these games that I covered were generally funded out of pocket, just from these people's kind of spare time or things like that. So, and I know that Steve and Carla, who made Gone Home, they worked in AAA games for a long time, saving up money so that they could start their own studio. So yeah, there's really kind of a fairly massive lack of funding for games, and a lot of people who made the games that I covered, they were doing their own production. So they were, they knew how much money they had per month to survive, and they knew how much money they had to pay contractors, and things, if they ran out of money, then the game would be delayed, and that's it. I asked Steve eventually, I said, what if at any point in development any of you had got sick? And he said, well, the game just wouldn't have come out. That's like how close to the bone game development is that, especially in the United States, like the culture is so shaped by the lack of a safety net or welfare in any way. In the UK, at least, when you're a freelancer, you can go, if you pay your taxes, you can go to the hospital anytime you like. You can go to your GP. It's free. There's a point of use. All healthcare in the UK is free. So there's a little bit less of a risk there if you want to be a freelancer or you want to go it alone and start your own business. But yeah, in other parts of the world, people don't have it quite so lucky. So a lot of these issues, which are cultural and political, directly impact the making of games as well.
Makes a lot of sense.
Absolutely.
So I'm seeing that we have a question from our Twitch audience, which is kind of related to one of the questions you have, Dylan. Do you have any idea of what a second book could be about?
I do, because I have a lot of open invitations. And they're probably quite old now, but I had open invitations to India and invitations to go to, there's one for Rio, I think. Definitely ones from South Africa. Yeah, there are lots of game development communities that contacted me to say, you should definitely visit us. We would love to have you. I'm pretty sure there's a really big game development community in Mexico. And these are parts of the world that I wasn't really anywhere near. And if I'd carried on, I definitely would have gone there. But by the time I got to Australia, 12 months later, I was just completely total. Like, I couldn't do it anymore. Like, my whole body was just aching, and I just really wanted private space of my own. So I kind of just stopped after 12 chapters, which is why I think there's no real sense of here's my arc, here's my conclusion. I did have a conclusion in the book, but it was much more kind of here's what I think I've learned so far, and here's what the most important things I think I've learned are. But there's no real sense of this is my final stop, kind of thing. So yeah, if I wrote another book, it would certainly be more of these countries, more into South America, maybe the African continent, go around that, because there are loads of different games communities in each part of Africa. So yeah, there's definitely a lot of there's definitely a lot of scope for that. The main thing is though now is that I am not poor now anymore, and I'm not completely desperate for a fee. So probably the internet wouldn't have to pay me a wage anymore. They could if they wanted to, but I think it would be possibly fairly uncouth to ask. I think a publishing deal would be enough. I didn't plan on that either. It was a surprise when a book publisher contacted me and say, we want to make this a real tangible object instead of an ebook that you make yourself. So apparently it sold very well for an independent book. And yeah, it's made across the world to you fine people. So all of these things were a huge surprise to me, and I'd definitely be into doing it again, but the gap in the timetable for games development is probably non-existent. But I don't know, if you all send me enough emails, I will contemplate doing it again.
So I'm actually gonna direct you to a couple more of Chris' thought-provoking
Oh,
musings.
okay.
We'll start with this one, I think.
Oh, so we've been talking about this book in the Twitch talk here before you came in, mostly as like an artifact of game studies and like what we can learn about game development and game creation from it. But there's this other side to it where it's interesting because of its prose and because of its personality. So, I mean, can you talk a bit about that? Like, what decisions you made, how you made it part travelogue, part journalism, part just creative narrative, and how sort of the writing about this came about, like the amount of effort you put into crafting prose and getting that just to where you wanted it. And did she freeze? Yes, we are frozen momentarily.
Oh, you're back.
Okay. Well, so I when it comes to how I wrote it, I mean, I only ever thought of it as being kind of like the kind of really weird gonzo journalism that I grew up with music journalism. I was pretty directly inspired by music journalism. I had never read any Hunter S. Thompson before I left. But my friend Dan Grill, who also used to be a games journalist, he sent me the audiobooks read by HST himself. And that was a real experience. I was just like, I would walk down like a road in Oakland and everyone will tell you, do not walk in Oakland anywhere. And I did it as this crazy Scottish woman who would just walk down the streets in Oakland listening to Hunter S. Thompson and being like, yes, very interesting. But it wasn't so much a conscious choice as just being like, if I don't anchor this story in my arc, what actually connects each of these interviews together, and how can people parse a beginning and end story from this journey? And I realized that I had to illuminate my biases and my personal taste in order to give you an understanding of why I was even asking these questions, because I think what's missing from very dry reportage about games is like, well, why are you asking about how many levels there are in this and how many enemies how many different types of enemies you can defeat, and like why bother asking about these very sort of dry facts? What does that really tell us about video games? And generally what it tells us about video games is that you only think that there's one kind of video game and one kind of thing that they can be. And so I wanted to illuminate, wanted to make it quite transparent that I'm very emotionally attached to games and that I have an opinion too. And the reason I'm asking these questions is because I feel like I personally have a bias towards a particular type of game. And I think it's useful to know the interviewer and the interviewee, and the roles that both of those people play is going to give you a very specific view on what a thing is. And I don't know, there's just a massive frustration for me that, I pitched this idea to a lot of outlets and said, would you give me the money to travel here and write about these particular people and then take photographs of them and then make an article out of it? And they said no. Or they kind of laughed in my face, or they kind of were like, why do that? Where would we give you that money? And it was frustration because I wanted to read someone else be like crazy and weird. I wanted to, it was a kind of, I think people invested in this kind of coverage because it was almost like a kind of like sadomasochistic voyeurism or something, where I feel like they wanted me to kind of go on this weird journey and like have all these aches and pains, and like I think they wanted a kind of person to feel like they identified with and like went on this exotic journey. And a lot of people, I think, ended up being quite jealous of me that I could do it. But I don't think the actual experience of it was as exotic and exciting as they thought that it was. It was actually very tiring, and I was always jet lagged. And I every day I woke up and I didn't know where I was or who was there or what I was going to be doing next week, which is quite scary. I didn't know if money was going to come in each month. I might have been stranded in Malaysia at one point. Who knew, you know? So yeah, like the point of that is to make it exciting. Like it's exciting to read about someone who's on the edge and who might not make it, right? And that's the situation I put myself in. I forced it. So that's probably half of the reason that people tuned in anyway.
Mm-hmm. So you heard it here first. Cara says people were jealous of her sadomasochistic experience.
I think they wanted to like, you know, see me on this like little progress map, you know, like the Street Fighter, like now you're in China, now you're in like, and then like you have to, you know, there's a challenger, that kind of
like
thing.
a little like, Indiana Jones.
I was gonna say,
plane.
or the Street Fighter 2 map where you're zooming around.
Like if you're playing like you know, like a board game with a map on it, and you move the pieces around, that kind of thing.
And I think your response there actually segued really nicely into the next question we had for you, which is at one point in the book, in the chapter with Catherine Neal and Harvey Smith, you write, "There shouldn't be a canon, but there always ends up being one, and it's never enough." And it seems to me that one thing that you're really doing with this book is that on one hand, games are a fairly young medium, and on the other hand, there's this canon that's so built up, and a lot of it is like, you know, from 20 years ago, like Legend of Zelda, you know, Mario, things like that. And it seems like you're trying to highlight things that are both outside of that and are really new.
Yeah, I mean, so Kieran Galen, who did the intro for this book, he has like he says this thing a lot, which is that, you know, a lot of people will like play down lists, you know, when every year, everyone will always write like, you know, the 10 best games of the year or whatever, and people will write up their games of the year list. And I always used to say, oh, like that's completely useless. Like, why would you have a games of the year list? Like, it is like it's not helpful. It's just a number. It's just, you know, and 10 is such an arbitrary number. Like, why don't we have like 50? You know, and I always used to say this to complain, and he would say, lists are really useful because everyone makes a list. You can see their perspective on things, what they think is important. It's always illuminating something to make a list. And so I have to give him that. I always thought that like having a canon of people, for example, English literature, there's the canon of like Author and then Shakespeare, and like, it's always like some white guy who had all these like amazing privileges in his life and then managed to get in this like amazing English, you know, canon of English literature. And but also what's interesting is if you make a canon of those people, there's always going to be an alt canon, a reaction against those given people in a list. And so I think in the end, I kind of came around to the idea that if I was making a canon, it would illuminate a very particular thing about the sort of games that I thought were important. And I thought as well it was important to give people a kind of history of 2014. I wanted to make a historical document, like a document of something that will be lost in time, because games are, you know, they're hard to preserve and they're intangible in many ways. And where do you find them? How do you have a machine that can play them now? Like, are they going to be lost in time? Like, I just wanted to write about something that, you know, would disappear unless I wrote about them. And that's not to say I mean, that makes me sound very self-important, but I think everyone should be writing these. Like, I think, in an ideal world, everyone would be writing their one of these books. That's what I want. I want to read those. Maybe not everyone wants to, but I want to read those books. And so yeah, so I thought, that was valuable to write that history down and say to people, like, because games have a really, the culture surrounding games has a really bad memory. People, I'll say stuff like, oh, have you seen this like explosion of Twine games? And someone else will say, like, who's much older than me, will be like, yeah, well, there was an explosion of interactive fiction when I was around. Like, have you seen this and this? Like, this has already been done. So yeah, there's, it should be, that information should be more, youngins to be like, oh, okay, this has been done. What are the lessons that have been learned before?
And speaking of you as a reader, I know that shortly after this project, you left games writing largely. I mean, the games criticism sphere. And I guess I want to talk a little bit about that transition. I know you wrote some fiction, and just the decisions behind that, and also what that experience was like.
And before you answer that question, we have one of the books that you wrote a short story in. Dave's going to put it in the catalog link or in the chat link here. But go ahead and talk about other fiction writing as well.
So yeah, no, I've done bits and pieces for lots of different people, in books as well as I've done comics. I've done television shows. I have done games. I've done lots of different things, and I think that's because it kind of scares me to put all my eggs in one basket. I'm really interested in the craft of writing, and because I'm interested in the craft of writing, I think that it's beholden to me to be able to stretch myself into every kind of writing. And I don't want to master one thing and have to do that for the rest of my life. I'm actually super interested in how writing, I think actually writing improves the more that you introduce the ideas of other media into it. So, and that's probably because of games, but I genuinely feel like, for example, comics have a lot in common with games. Comics, I think Matt Fraction said, comics are like sculpting with time, because with comics you have to look at the panels and like what they really say about a very small moment in time, and then what its relationship to the next panel over, and that next panel is also a moment in time. It's like those panels and how they relate to each other is really interesting, and that's a lot like animation. And a lot of this is really, really kind of pertinent to games, because comics have to be concise, and they have to be so there can't be that much dialogue, and that's just like games. If you've got dialogue in games, and they tend to overlap, and then it's too much information at once, and then it's very tiring to hear lots of things in games said to you or about you. So actually a lot of comics are about editing and like very small amounts of text, and lots to do with visuals, and so are games. So yeah, so I tried to stretch myself a lot into other media, because I think that's really important. But largely my knowledge of games as a medium has really helped me to adapt my writing to writing for games. But it has been like a painful kind of long 3 years, because really games are incredibly hard to write for, and that's mainly because you are kind of a linchpin in a very large kind of arena where you have to constantly circle back through loads of different disciplines in order to sort of make sure that you all have the same meaning and are on the same page about the thing. And so largely I've actually stopped writing, as in like writing dialogue or writing that goes on screen in a game, and I've started designing. So I started saying, how can I design a puzzle that ends up with a story meaning that I want, for example. And that is very, very difficult. And that's actually more to do with the idea of game design than it is to do with writing as a craft. So yeah, so in the last 3 years, I've pretty much been stretched in the design direction a lot more, which actually makes me more interested in the craft of writing. I don't get to do it anymore really too much anyway. So that's interesting.
And can you just almost tell us, like, give us an idea of a day in the life? I mean, do you go into the Media Molecule office? Do you, how does this all kind of work?
So currently the day in the life is I get up, I go to work. I usually make myself a very large coffee in a mug that has a hilarious slogan on it. And then Media Molecule has a very good selection of coffee mugs. And then I go to my desk, I answer a million emails, usually to do with, oh my God, there's a fire. Can you put, and then I generally meet with everyone a lot about how we can fix a problem that we found in the game and how story can help with fixing that problem. And then I will meet everyone who can help me fix that problem. So I will usually write, like, maybe write some like a script. I usually write in a screenwriting format. Usually mostly just action instead of dialogue. And then I'll consult with animation and game design and production and what else will I consult with? Audio. And I'll ask them, hey, is this possible? Can we do this? Is this a thing that we can do, that we can put in the game and it will solve this problem for us? And more often than not, there'll be some kind of problem with the plan that I've plotted out, and we'll tweak it slightly. And then it'll happen with everyone where we'll tweak it slightly. Every meeting with game design, I'll tweak it slightly. Every meeting with audio, I'll tweak it slightly until it kind of fits with the way that everyone thinks the problem can be solved. And then we say, okay, let's put it in the game. That's the part that's really hard, because video games largely, they never really, like when you sit down to make something, it never really turns out the way that you imagine it's going to in the planning stage. That's why we have iteration. So we try to implement it the way that we plan. Sometimes it works, but more often than not, it doesn't come out quite the way you imagine. And then we spend most of the rest of the time iterating on it to make sure that it says the thing that we want it to say.
Cara, that is true of Twitch streaming as well.
I was gonna say we're all smiling and nodding here.
Cool. So yeah, so I think that's pretty much how the day pans out, and that's pretty much every single day we do that. And eventually at the end of it, a video game comes out, and it's never the video game that people want to release, because really video games are never actually finished being made. It's like probably at some point a painter has to look at what they've painted and go, well, it's not the thing I wanted, but it'll do, and I really need the money, so I'm going to put it out. So it's kind of like, that's what it's like with every game I think that I've ever worked on, is everyone's like, okay, we've got to the stage where we can release it, let's release it. And yeah, like I think genuinely, I think that is a creative process that practically everyone in every medium does to some extent. Just like with independent games, it's like one person has to do all that themselves sometimes, and like with AAA games, it's like loads of people, hundreds of people all doing that at the same time, which can be like harder, but yeah, with a good production team like we have like it's really cool. So yeah.
Well, I know I'm really looking forward to Dreams. It doesn't have a release date yet, does it?
Nope.
Nope. Just when I guess I was gonna say when it's done, but I suppose it's when it's good enough, as you say.
When it's ready.
Yeah.
When it escapes.
Totally. Yeah, when it escapes the Media Molecule compound.
So speaking of lists, one thing that we want to ask you is if there are some games that you've played in the last year or two that you really want to highlight that you think were overlooked and that people should take a gander at.
God, I haven't. They don't tell you this, but like once you start making games, you just stop playing them really, unless they're the game you're working on. You don't really play anything anymore.
Every game developer I've met tells me that constantly. Actually,
it's really horrible as well because you want to keep up to date with what people are doing. I always refer people to Curated Zero, even though it's probably not. There's not been an episode out for a while now, but I really love that game so much, mainly because it's contemplative in a way that it's basically, it forces you to slow down in lots of ways. And in any other game that would be frustrating, but for some reason I find it really relaxing and lovely when Curated Zero has that slow pace and like this slow appearance of the text, which they do deliberately to make you feel like you're in a dream state. I find that really interesting and amazing. So yeah, so I really love that game. But
and you're talking about you cut out real quick, but you're talking about Kentucky Route Zero?
Yes, Kentucky Zero. Yeah. But honestly, I've only been playing The Witcher 3 for the past like 10 years. So I don't really have any new insights apart from that Geralt is like the greatest guy ever and a babe. And
a little emo too.
Lopping off lots of people's heads and it's great. That's all I have to really offer.
I was gonna say, it seems to me that about half the staff of Rock Paper Shotgun is somewhere in the middle of The Witcher 3, just slowly making their way through.
It's true. Like everyone I know is just lost in his abs, his beautiful eyes. So yeah, but yeah, no, I think that it's actually really wonderful in The Witcher 3 how they make consequences happen. So if you're in like a random encounter with a guy who like, I don't know, attacks, like he basically like racially abuses you or whatever in a bar and it's like, oh, you know, you're a witcher, you're a horrible mutant and like, we're going to kill you, whatever. If you like deal with that random encounter by like chopping his head off and murdering like him, then the next time you come back to that village, there's like 5 of his friends and they'll turn up and they'll be like, oh, that's him, that's who murdered my friend. And then if you deal with that, like by murdering everyone, then the next time you like ride through that place, then like 10 like all of the village will be in uproar and they'll be like, it's the murderer, it's the murderer. And lots of games don't really give you those consequences, and you start to kind of realize that not only are you actually a mass murderer, but you feel very guilty about it, but you're actually making life very hard for yourself by solving every problem with murder. And so few games actually recognize that, and it actually has a big story consequence for you. It makes you feel more like you are not a very good character, not a very good person. And so you actually start to make choices in a more nuanced way. And that is a story consideration that I always think about. I think game design and story intersect much more than we like to think, especially when you give a particular character to players to use. So yeah, like I think about that a lot. That's something I take away from it.
You guys, any other questions within you?
Do we have anything from the chat? So one thing, and I'm going to mispronounce the Dutch name, but Adrian de Jong. You and him really get into some games that are cooperative and that demand a different type of cooperation than some other games do. And I think that's really interesting because video games, interactive media, is cooperative in a way that is different from the cooperation that I have with you as an author when I read your book, right? When I play your game, I have to cooperate with you as a storyteller in a certain way. But there's also another type of cooperation where the storyteller can force two humans to cooperate with each other. And you can get into varying levels of complexity with that. How, as a game designer, do you think about that? And how, as a games journalist, do you think about that as being the same medium when you add in these extra layers and things like that?
Well, what's interesting is that games when you think about things like film, for example, being like a directed experience. So like you are forced to take the director's view because the director is in charge of the camera and where you're looking, right? So they have more control over what you're seeing, the ultimate control. With games, you don't usually, as a game designer, you are relinquishing a lot of where the players are looking, and sometimes you're relinquishing the ability to tell or force them to like the selection of actions that they undertake. Sometimes you don't really know which verb they are going to use in like a particular moment. But actually games are a lot more directed than you think they are. And that's because game designers will give you like a restricted set of actions and a restricted set of places you can go and a restricted set of things you can do. And it's our job to tell you what you can do and what you can't do. And because we have control over those things, we test for every outcome. So we try to like be able to, what most of game design is just fooling you into thinking that you have control over these things. Mm-hmm. You don't. We have control over it, and we know you're going to try and fuck with it. And there's a really interesting thing where, so there's probably a bunch of YouTube videos I haven't checked recently, where in GTA 4 you can like you can like drive into a swing set, I think it is, at high speed, and then it'll just like ping into the universe or something. It's like this bug that's been there forever. I don't think they've ever corrected it. Really, it's in there because the physics system can't calculate a very large object moving at high speed, crashing into a very, very thin object, immovable object even. For some reason, the swing set was always immovable. It's like, I don't know, you can't destroy them. And so like when that calculation happens in the collision, it can't calculate it fast enough for whatever reason, and the physics system kind of just like rejects it. And then a weird thing happens. And when that happened to us, we knew that it was something that we couldn't really account for in fixing it. We could fix it, but it would just mean that other problems would happen elsewhere. So what's interesting about that is we were like, well, it's funny. So is it really a downside if we let players do this? Is it bad? It's a bug, sure, and it's an obvious bug, but like, is it really bad? Why don't we just let players do it? Because, you know, it's funny. Mm-hmm. Which is, I guess, what we used to, at RPS, we used to call that the Roger Rabbit rule. If it's funny, it's okay. So there's a number of things you have to take into account, which is that should you be able to do it is a question you can ask, but is it bad if you can do it is the main thing that we ask ourselves. We want to give you the illusion that you have complete control over whatever's happening. But honest to God, you never really have control over what's happening. We always predict what you can and cannot do, what you can and cannot use. We are always there over your shoulder going, aha, we knew you were going to do that. The weird thing is, like, when people take the systems that you have made and then use them in like these emergent ways, which I think is the most interesting thing. So there's things like DayZ where like human psychology has completely overridden that game. So like people, take each other prisoner in these like really sinister ways and like stalk each other and like all these horrible things that like no one on DayZ in the development team really ever thought would happen. That's when it becomes really interesting, because you create a system where it can be overridden occasionally by the way that the game designers have designed it. But like, yeah, basically it's an interesting one because generally speaking, most video games are tested so that you're never playing it in an unexpected way.
So with that in mind, how do you feel about when modders go in mod games and really take over those decision-making processes from the game designers, and they sort of become the game designers? Like, is that co-opting someone's art? Is it creating new art? Do you have strong feelings about it?
Fan fiction.
Yeah.
I know some people have strong feelings about that kind of thing. I know that Anne Rice always used to get mad about it because she didn't want her hot vampires doing anything apart from what she said they did. But I don't know. I don't have a strong feeling too much. I mean, obviously I'm working on Dreams, which is a game about constantly remixing assets that we give you. So, we're super into people doing whatever they like, as long as it's not, as long as it's, PG rated. So we do kind of occasionally, we know that the first moment that the game goes live, someone is going to draw a dick somewhere. So we're ready. We're poised to destroy those dicks. But yeah, that's something I never thought I would say. But yeah, like I think in general, people, as long as you're not getting money for something that should, the money that should be going to someone for something, I think is a thing to consider. But I think generally speaking, it's cool. It's okay to play. I think learning is more important than like most other things in the world. And I think that if you're educating yourself by like modding something, I think that's super great. Most of the game designers I know were modders before they were anything official. And so, I mean, I just like messed around with loads of different engines before I became a game designer. So I think that it's really important to consider the context of what you're doing and like whether it is like, I mean, obviously if it's going against someone's wishes, I would definitely think twice as to whether or not it's okay to like remix or reuse anything that someone has made. And obviously with big companies, there's lots of legal issues where, if you use a Disney character, Disney is going to sue you or whatever. But I think generally speaking, experimentation of any kind should be allowed, especially on, in the use of your private home. But yeah, like I generally think that like if you want to look inside of a game, like I remember like when I played Dungeon Keeper, there was an amazing, actually my boss Mark Healy at Miyamoto, he made Dungeon Keeper, which is kind of weird. He's like a total legend, and I work for him, and that's cool. But he made the dungeon maker inside of Dungeon Keeper, and so he made it so that you could like make your own little dungeon and like fill it with like horrible things and like kill all the heroes. And that was like my first introduction to level design, and I think that was super valuable to me. And so it's really nice that games are like actually officially opening those channels now to like people who always were modding, but they were doing it in secret and they were doing it maybe without permission. Like now there's lots of ways in which you can do those things, but permission. So it's cool.
Well, we did have one person in the chat who just said, "Wow, thanks for the interview. Much knowledge."
Much knowledge.
Much knowledge.
Many things.
And I do want to second that. I know you need to go to bed pretty shortly, but we really appreciate both your patience and getting this all set up, and just the level of your insight, and of course the writing in your wonderful book. And I guess I would also say, if you have anything,
I had a good time.
Oh, thank you. If you have anything you want to plug or tell us about, point us to.
I don't have anything currently apart from please buy Dreams when it comes out. It will be amazing. You will have fun.
Yeah, you may have thought the Dreams were free, but they will cost approximately $60.
Yes, that is amazing, and you can use it forever to make everything that you dream of.
Oh, well, I'm really looking forward to it.
Yay!
Okay, so we're gonna move away from Skype here. Thank you so much, Cara. Let's give Cara a round of applause. You can actually hear applause here. And we're going to move away from Skype real quick and plug the next section of the Gamers Book Club. And Cara, if you are a fan of Dr. Chess, Surya Chess, and Carly Korick,
yeah.
with Coin-Operated Americans and Ready Player 2, you are welcome to join us for those. But Dylan's going to talk about those in 1 second. Again, thank you so much, Cara.
Thank you.